Hey folks, Nick here from Another BookTube channel, asking you today, at what point do you become engaged in the book that you are reading? This topic was, this is basically a response to Gareth's video from Books, Songs, and Other Magic from his channel, where he talked about the idea of becoming locked in on a book, that point, that threshold that has to be crossed, where you switch on and say, okay, yeah, I'm into this. Let's keep going. Thought it was an interesting topic that has no, at least for me, no solid answer, because I think it varies very widely depending on the genre that you're reading, as well as just the type of story that it is. Um, because I think you have different expectations based on genre. I'm primarily a genre reader, so this might not apply so much to just literary fiction, but I think that there are certain storytelling beats and a structure that needs to be adhered to in order for me to feel that engagement, that sense of being locked in. And if a book isn't following that structure, it's not necessarily going to be a bad thing, but it is maybe an uphill battle, and makes it harder to lock in on that book. Um, the first book that I really thought about as a book that didn't catch me right away is actually my current read, "The Sunlit Man" by Brandon Sanderson. If you know, Sanderson is a fantasy writer who's really kind of more. He's becoming more science fiction than fantasy, because his Cosmere world is becoming so advanced technology wise, but kind of blurs that line a little bit. Uh, but he's constantly creating these fantastical worlds that require a great deal of explanation. And typically, I think he does a really, really great job of easing readers into his fantasy worlds and dropping little pieces of world building as an on ramp to kind of get you going and catch your interest. Be like, ooh, I wonder what that word means. Like that's a fantasy word. I don't know that word. I wonder what it's going to be. And then like leading you along, and then ultimately he'll do a big exposition dump where we get the full explanation, and that to me is like the easiest, most simple way to do it. It's one that I respond to pretty much every time. In his most recent book, The Sunlit Man, he does something similar, but it kind of struggles in the beginning, in my opinion, where the main character is like dropped onto a new world and he doesn't speak their language yet. And so we're immediately in an action sequence. We don't really know who the main character is. We don't know who the aggressors are. We don't know why they're attacking him. We don't know what he's running from. So the first like few chapters, I was honestly kind of bored, immediately, because I was like, I don't know what is happening here. I need a little bit more than this. And he eventually gives that. He gives us those clues of like, this is what the world is, and this is what the magic kind of looks like, and then that is what strings you along. But it was kind of a weird opening. And I think that that's something to be mindful of with fantasy and sci-fi in particular, because these are usually unrealistic worlds that need to explain themselves. And I think that the longer it takes you to explain yourself, the harder it is to lock in, especially if you're using a lot of new vocabulary words. I think of like Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, which used a ton of sci-fi technobabble in the first like 50 pages and explained none of it. And I ended up DNFing that book because I had zero interest in what was going on because I could not follow what the hell was being said. And that's the risk you run. I also thought about The Eye of the World, the first book in the Wheel of Time, because the first time I attempted this book, I got about like 50 pages in, and then I stopped because I was like, this isn't for me. It's kind of slow. I don't really know what's going on here. Because if you've ever read this, the prologue to this book, the first time you ever read Wheel of Time, and you read the prologue, it makes no sense. It is so confusing. And you're immediately like, you begin this 14-book journey being not just like unaware of what's going on, but lost. Like the words barely even register in your head. Dangerous, very dangerous. Obviously you're not gonna, if you're, so when you're starting a story this large, you've got to start somewhere. And I wonder if Robert Jordan chose like the right place to start. In the long run, it all works out. But I eventually picked this book up again to retry it. And I found that at the 75-page mark, I finally got the hook. Or maybe a little bit before 75, where the Trollocs attack for the first time. And that was the moment where I went, oh, that's what this book is. Like, that's what this story is. Like, it was just that little click moment. And from that point on, I was engaged. And then I breezed through the rest of it, and I finished the entire Wheel of Time. And it was great. But it's the time getting to the hook, really. And the hook is ultimately what is the thing that locks you in. You need an interesting hook, particularly in genre fiction, to say, like, this is what makes this book different from everything else that you've read. And if you don't like that hook, you're never going to be locked in. Another example of a non-sci-fi fantasy example, going with horror, The Only Good Indians. This was a book where I was not sure what it was doing for like the first 100 pages. It was interesting, and because it was interesting and just being very different than what I expected, that kept me going. But I wasn't sold on it. I was like, what is happening here? Like, what's going on? And then something happens like a third of the way through the book that completely rocked my world. And I was like, oh, that's what this is. I get it. Okay, now I'm hooked. That's the thing. So you need a good hook. And in horror, I talked about how in fantasy and sci-fi, you kind of want to get as much context as possible right away to be hooked. In horror, it's a little bit different, because if it's a supernatural story, you don't want to overplay your hand. You don't want to reveal too much, because that takes away from the horror. That's the difference in the genre. So you have to just give enough to make you want to keep going. And that could just be introducing some really interesting characters that you want to hear about, or introducing a unique type of killer, or a unique just type of supernatural situation that just is different than what you've kind of read before, or is just presented in a good way. Something that I think of is like the books of like Shirley Jackson, which are classics. So they've been, they've been much impersonated at this point. So you're not getting too much originality anymore if you're reading them today, but it's the writing style of Shirley Jackson that hooks you in. I feel the same way about Ray Bradbury. His writing style is what hooks me into his books. I think he has a beautiful way with words. When you have a really good narrative voice, like Kurt Vonnegut, his stories are absurd, and the stories are secondary to just him or secondary to the way that he tells the story. And that's what works for me. So it's different hooks based on different authors, different genres, different types of stories. So there is no like concrete answer to what do you need to hook me personally into a book. It just needs to be something different. Honestly, you need to not take too long to get there, and it just needs to be told in an interesting way. And that's really what it boils down to. It's a really long way to get to a very simple answer. To elaborate on Gareth's video a little bit, I want to talk about comic books, because getting me hooked into a comic book is a different story entirely. Because for me, the art plays a huge factor in that. Art plays a huge role in that, because there are writers of comics that are like that I will gravitate towards, and I'll read them, or I'll at least give their books a chance, no matter who the artist is. That's like Alan Moore, Tom King, James Tynion the Fourth. Um, I don't look at who's drawing it. I say, oh, I see their names. I say, okay, let me try that. And then if I'm reading it and the art doesn't speak to me, I'll stop reading it. Alan Moore worked on he had a book called Tomorrow Stories. It ran for 12 issues, and it was an anthology series. And there was a feature in each of those issues called Madame Cobweb, with art by Melinda Gebbie. And I recognize that Melinda Gebbie is a good artist, but her art style did not appeal to me. And so when I eventually just realized that whenever I would get to one of those stories, I would skip it. Like, even though Alan Moore is writing it, because the art was not what I enjoyed, I skip it. So when I say that, like, art is what really sells me and hooks me in, I really mean that. I bought this big boy, Hodorowski and Mobius's The Inkle, the complete Inkle, deluxe black and white edition. I bought this on the strength of just wanting to look at pretty pictures drawn by Mobius. Like, that was it. I didn't even glance at what the book was about. I don't care about Alejandro Hodorowski. And I've read this, and it's good, but the story is not what I love about this. It's the artwork. And I guess I'll wrap up here by paraphrasing Todd McFarlane. Todd McFarlane's one of the most popular comic book artists of all time, whether you want to admit it or not. In the 90s, Todd McFarlane ruled. I mean, his Spider-Man, his Spawn at Image. I mean, Todd McFarlane was the guy. He was making comics people wanted to buy. And I don't remember the exact quote, so I'll paraphrase, but what he said is, if my mother wrote a comic book and I drew it, you would buy it. But if I wrote a comic book and my mother drew it, you wouldn't buy it. And that's 100% true. Because you can open a comic book, see art that you enjoy, and be like, yeah, okay, I'll get this. And even if I don't like the story, I'll like looking at it. And that is more likely to happen than picking up a comic book, opening it up and seeing art you don't like, and then being like, let me give this a chance anyway because maybe I'll like the story. No, those pictures, your first impression matter really, really, like, a lot. That first impression means a lot. So if you don't have art that you connect with, the comics are not going to hook you in. So that's my ramble. Thank you for tagging me in your video, Gareth. I hope this was a worthwhile response. Let me know in the comments what your guys' thoughts are on this topic. What is required to hook you into a book? Curious to hear about that. Thank you very much for spending some time with me today, but now it's time to get back to reading.